Okay. Good evening, distinguished speakers and viewers joining us from around the world. Welcome to the virtual event of Freedom Hour, an online discussion hosted by the Asia Freedom Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that promotes democracy and religious freedom in Tibet and China. I'm Sakina Bhatt, and I'm the moderator for today's panel. And today's panel discussion, 2024 Taiwan presidential election, a post-election discussion, promises to be a compelling exploration of the recent electoral events and their profound implications, not just for Taiwan, but for the international community. And we are honored to have with us Martin Williams, a seasoned journalist with deep insights into Taiwan's political landscape, and Chuni Cheng, a dedicated human rights worker whose expertise will bring a crucial perspective to the discussion. A very warm welcome, dear panelists, to AFI's discussion. And before I start, let me quickly run you through the agenda for today's question. So we will be having 9 questions in total. So out of the 9, 6 questions are general. That is, 6 questions are prevalent to both the speakers, Chuni and Martin. And we have 3 specific questions exclusively for Martin. So maybe we can start with the questions now without further ado. And maybe I can start with Martin, followed by Chuni. Okay, so Martin, Lai Ching-te achieved a historic victory in last Saturday's elections in Taiwan. But the margin of his victory is 40% of the ballots cast, which was smaller as compared to the 2020, where President Tsai Ing-wen won with a record-breaking of over 57% of the ballot. And Lai's ruling party, Democratic Progressive Party, lost its majority in the parliament, right? So what was at stake in Taiwan's election? And in your view, can you give us 3 takeaways from the election results? And what is the current mood of the people in Taiwan now? Martin, the screen is yours.
Yes, thanks, Sakina, and hello, everyone. What's at stake in this election? Well, given that much of the controversy around Taiwan and China and cross-strait relations and relations between Taiwan and various other nations is going to be more or less the same before and after this election, the overall thing that was at stake was that the election process itself, I think the credibility, the integrity of the election process itself was upheld. And that, in fact, was what happened. A free and fair election ensued. And this was despite multi-pronged attempts by the Chinese government to influence the result and if possible, discredit the process. Instead, what happened, a result was obtained. It was a free and fair result. The result has been accepted by all parties, regardless of the fact that only a 40% victory was obtained by the leading candidate. It is nonetheless one of the aspects of a first-past-the-post process that Taiwan has, that it is possible to win with 40% of the vote, or even less. It's important to know that the 40% vote that William Lai got in this election was slightly more than that Chen Shui-bian got back in 2000. And neither then nor now has there been any issue of a mandate coming into question, though some Western observers seem to think that the election process itself does not lend itself that mandate because of this quirk. The only thing I would add to that is other countries' presidential election systems have different systems in place. There is a runoff system in France, for example, where the top 2 candidates will then compete for a 50% majority. They don't have that system here, and I think most people accept it, and that's not particularly controversial here.
Thank you, Martin.
Takeaways. I'm sorry, you asked about takeaways. The takeaways for me, and I'll be very interested to hear what Tuni has to say about this, because we've had agreements and disagreements on things in the past. For me, the takeaways are, first of all, it points to a stable outcome. It is a continuity on the stable government of Tsai Ing-wen, the current president, for the next 4 years. I'm sure we will see a fairly easy transition into issues involving international engagement. Relations with Washington, at least the Biden administration, will be continue to prosper, and we will see slow, but I assume productive progress in defense policy and defense reforms, as well as an ongoing competent economic policy and ongoing overall competent executive leadership in the cabinet, which is chosen by the president and approved by the legislature. The second takeaway is that the KMT is now in the majority, though it is not doesn't have executive power. It won by one seat, 52 to 51, though the other two independents in the legislature are pro-KMT independents. So it's an effective vote of 54 to 51. The balance of power, however, is held by the Taiwan People's Party, and this is an issue of considerable concern and interest to people observing overseas. They secured 8 seats in the party list vote, which is a third vote in which every person who votes can vote for a party instead of the president or an individual legislator. And the TPP increased its vote of party list legislators from 5 to 8, and that has given it rock solid veto power over any legislation, unless the KMT and the DDP were to agree, which in most cases may not be the case. Now, this gives a certain amount of new influence to the Taiwan People's Party's chair, Ko-Wen-je, a surgeon and former 8-year mayor of Taipei City. And some speculate that a cabinet post might be offered to him by the DPP government in order to keep him and his legislators on side. In any case, we might expect some expedited representation of those 8 Taiwan People's Party legislators in legislative committees. But by and large, we are in something of an uncharted situation here. Because, Chuni, correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a long time, if ever, since a third party held the balance of power in the legislature. And that means that both the DPP, the party that will retain control of the executive, and the KMT in opposition are going to have to be negotiating with 2 different parties at all times. So it's going to be a very, very interesting 4 years. There's going to be considerable pressure on the Taiwan People's Party to both balance the interests of its own voters as well as the careers of these legislators who are looking to make an instant mark. The third takeaway I would say very quickly is that what the success of the Taiwan People's Party represents here is a strong desire for voting options outside the main 2 parties. Now, it is not a new phenomenon for a third party to come into the picture and take a lot of votes from the other 2 parties. It is a new phenomenon that this one has got a lot of control in the legislature. In the past, however, what is quite interesting here is that the most disruptive parties, third parties, have been splinter parties from the KMT. This party, on the other hand, seems to have attracted votes from both major parties, and particularly younger voters who are perhaps a little bit weary of the identity politics that has taken over a lot of the campaign time, as opposed to policy-driven issues. And that's all I will have to say on
that. Thank you so much, Martin. And how is the mood of the people in Taiwan right now? Can you just tell us about that briefly?
It's as calm and as relieved a mood as I can remember. I've seen quite a few elections here. There's been no major controversy. There is some controversy about accusations of vote tampering, but it's nothing outside the usual parameters of Taiwanese politics. There were some investigations into people who may have been receiving Chinese largesse or receiving subsidized trips to China, and those investigations will continue. But overall, it's been a very peaceful protest, a highly successful election, and a credit to democracy around the world, I think.
Thank you so much, Martin, for sharing us your view. Chuni, let's hear yours.
Well, Martin has pointed out some very important aspects, and I'd like just to supplement a little bit. My key takeaways are that the 3 major parties have gained something. So it's not just DPP's victory. I think every party has gained something. DPP won the presidency, while Kuomintang, KMT, becomes the largest party in the parliament. And Taiwan People Party gained a high support rate for the presidency vote as well as their party vote, and that allowed them to have 8 legislative seats at large, which is unprecedented for any other third party in history. So this is my first main takeaway. And the second takeaway, as Martin has pointed out, that there is quite some need from the people to have an alternative choice other than the two major parties, especially for the young people. And I think for the future, the young people's votes would be perhaps again decisive for the national election results. So these are my takeaways to supplement what Martin had just pointed out. And about the post-election public mood, I think it's been peaceful and quite quiet, and life goes on as usual. However, there are some heated discussions on the speakership should be taken care of in the next 2 weeks, because a new legislative session will start on the 1st of February. So that means in the next 2 weeks, the three parties would have to work out on the potential candidates to become the speaker and the vice president of the legislative yuan. And that kind of struggle or negotiations would also have some impact on the political landscape for the executive branch in the future. And the presidential inauguration won't start until 20th of May. So there's a long kind of interim period for the administration. And I think the appointment of speakership would impact that process as well.
Thank you so much for sharing with us the really important 3 takeaways, and also like talking about the rise of the unprecedented third party, which is the TPP, and we shall delve more into that later. Now, moving on to the second question. China's pressure has been increasing on the Taiwanese people weeks before the election, right? And has warned the Taiwanese voters to make the right choice, and have literally framed their election as a choice between peace and war. What impact will Lai Ching-te's victory have on cross-strait relations? How will Beijing view this election, and how is it going to respond? Martin.
Well, this is one of the key questions that I'm sure a lot of people outside Taiwan are wanting answers to. And at this time, it's quite impossible to say. The situation in China now has become so insular and so forbidding for what used to be fairly, an opportunity for people to understand what was going on in Zhongnanhai, that we'll just have to wait and see. But what we can say is that up until the election, of course, for months, in fact, for years, the Chinese government have been attempting to intimidate Taiwan by flying fighter jets into its air defense identification zone, sending People's Liberation Army naval vessels into waters around Taiwan, as well as, of course, some time ago, missile tests, some of which flew directly over Taiwan and landed in foreign nations' economic territory. In the lead up to this election, there have been a few extras of interest, such as balloons flying over Taiwan and possibly drones, and of course a satellite launch that was originally miscommunicated to be a missile by the Ministry of Defense here, subsequently corrected. But that particular object apparently strayed off the course that it was expected to take and flew very near Taiwan as well. Now, those things, people here tend to take these things in their stride. These are not causes for concern or panic, possibly confusion. But by and large, in the lead up to this election, we've seen very similar things to previous elections. one of the most direct hands-on attempts to influence elections here have been subsidized China travel for the lowest level of elected officials, people called borough wardens, the lowest level of people who are elected in little hamlets within towns and cities. A number of those people are now under investigation. Some have been detained. But again, the scale is fairly small for the kind of numbers that you think Beijing would need in order to tip a result. In addition to that, and perhaps more concerning to those who want to defend an honest and fair democratic process, the stream of online propaganda and disinformation that is available, that it comes from China and from places sympathetic to China, including people in Taiwan. Videos, mocked up videos, rumor mongering in chat groups, activists by the so-called Wumao, the 50 centers as they call them, the Chinese paid propagandists, whose overall attempt is to demean and discredit institutions and electoral processes. Now, again, I would say, given the result we've had here, those efforts have again, by and large, been a failure. However, it is not correct to say that they haven't had an impact, and some of those impacts may be more subtle than we're able to detect. I'm certainly not an expert in that side of things, but it is clear, given some of the interviews and some of the statements being made by people in mass media here, that there should be greater punishment for people, particularly Taiwanese citizens, who transmit or produce this kind of material. How that will be handled is tricky, because Taiwan tends to be rather soft on people who sort of move in a sort of a treasonous direction, if you like. Prison sentences are few and far between, and usually only for those who do the most terrible things and work for the military or for military intelligence. Everyone else tends to be treated fairly softly, and that's just kind of the place Taiwan is. It's a civilized place. In addition, however, there were some very serious issues leading up to this election, particularly in the last couple of weeks. The former president, Ma Ying-jeou, who was the president before the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, was interviewed by Deutsche Welle, the German media organization, in a longish interview in which, in one brief section, he more or less aped Chinese talking points, Chinese government talking points, by suggesting that that there was no way that Taiwan could defend itself ultimately from a Chinese attack, and that Taiwanese people should trust in the Chinese Secretary General of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping. And this, certainly to a number of moderate KMT officials, was a disastrous development. But it wasn't just him. Han Kuo-yu, the former presidential candidate for the KMT 4 years ago, also seemed to delve into that by suggesting that it would be inappropriate for the government to build new defense facilities in a certain area because it would make that place a target for Chinese military, which again seems to be a little too close perhaps to people who are trying to denigrate the Taiwanese military. So that was a bit of a problem. And apart from that, commercially, Taiwanese who are resident in China for business or for education have also been directly lobbied by people there to vote in a certain way. We know that anecdotally. And I've also already mentioned the borough warden problem. There is the issue. The government recognizes this. It does put some resources into defending against online misinformation. And there has been a debunking process. Denials are quick to be released by government agencies that say certain things have been put out there that are wrong. And there are also significant civic group efforts, voluntary efforts by ordinary citizens to combat this kind of material as well. And I'm pleased to say those things are kind of non-partisan. They do not support a particular party, but they're very interested in defending the fundamentals and the reputation of Taiwanese democracy.
Thank you, Martin, for giving us a detailed information. And let's hear, Chuni, what's your view on this?
Yes, I'd like to supplement on that. China already responded to the election results by luring Nauru into establish diplomatic ties with China and sever diplomatic ties with Taiwan. So that's the kind of present, in quotation mark, that the Chinese government is presenting to the people of Taiwan. And also, the Chinese authority spokesperson mentioned that the fact the Lai only garnered 40% of the total vote, that signifies that Lai Ching, the president-elect, does not represent the mainstream public opinion. So I think China is likely to continue its tactics mentioned by Martin, and also continue to squeeze Taiwan's international space while continuing stirring up domestic rifts by spreading all these rumors or trying to lobby different groups or favoring different groups, and also sending signals of intimidation around the Taiwan airspace as well as the maritime space. And I think,
Thank you.
okay,
Yeah, sure.
yeah,
Yeah, sure. Tell me, please go on.
yes, I think the impact on cross-strait relations is that China's tactics in the past have not won the hearts of the people of Taiwan, and Taiwan people will continue to safeguard the status quo of peace, democracy, and freedom, while seeking to maintain the current economic cooperation despite the political differences. I think that's the tone for now and also for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shuni. And the next question is for Martin. Martin, like we have discussed, the Taiwanese government in the days leading up to the elections criticized China's repeated interference and condemned Beijing for blatantly intimidating the Taiwanese people. There were also reports of disinformation campaign launched by China, like you mentioned. So I think you have more or less covered up the efforts made by China to interfere or intimidate or disinform the Taiwan government and the Taiwanese people. How did the Taiwanese government, the election authorities, and the voters counter such threats and actions of these actions of the Chinese government? Sorry, Martin, screen is yours.
Sure. As I said, this has become such a structural issue around election time that the government has more or less got a bipartisan approach to debunking rumors that are spread. You will note that most government departments have a regular debunking news media release. If you go through the media, the web pages for media releases from more sensitive government departments like Defense, for example, and the Central Election Commission, they regularly put out statements that indicate the government is quite sensitive to and aware of the disinformation or misinformation that is spread by, originally from Beijing or from elsewhere. It doesn't necessarily have to be from Beijing, of course. So in that regard, there's nothing particularly new in terms of the message. The hostility of the Chinese government to democratic development in Taiwan is nothing new. Firing missiles in Taiwan's direction is nothing new. It first happened in 1996 in the sort of democratic era, and certainly back in the 50s when Taiwan was defending the islands of Jinmen. So what we probably are looking at now is how can the government actually learn from its experiences, adapt to new technological threats. Not only, it should be said, not only the spread of wrong information, but also, the kinds of technological interference that could actually see systems shut down. Because one of the interesting things about Taiwan's electoral system, and it's a precious thing, is its very simple ballot system, which many countries have long abandoned and to go electronic. Like the United States, for example, many states have electronic ballots, I should say. But because you've got that basic hard, the fabric of the ballot to put a stamp on in the Taiwanese context, you can't sort of send a bug down the system. What you can do is data at a central location, but in the end, the original ballots themselves are secure. So there are many things that the government has already in its arsenal to defend its democratic structures, and there are many more than those. But I should admit that this is not my area. So there are others who are far more well briefed than I am on defences. But it is of interest that these things are becoming far more conspicuous in the media. People are now much more concerned about these things.
Thank you, Martin. And you've spoken about that there was a successful election and it went on very smoothly. And President-elect Lai will be assuming his office from from May this year. So everybody is very concerned and they are very curious about how his policies are going to be like, if it's going to be the same as Tsai Ing-wen, or will he try to do something differently, especially on issues like foreign policy and cross-strait relations. Can you tell us what is his plan and what are some of the challenges that are awaiting him, Martin?
It's probably best to be very brief on this point. One of the things that William Lai made very clear in his campaign was that a William Lai government would be a continuing of much of the policy of the Tsai Ing-wen government. In a way, he rode on Tsai Ing-wen's coattails and her achievements in office, not least of which was increasing the credibility of Taiwan in the international sphere as a stable, predictable, reliable partner. Previously, DPP government under Chen Shui-bian, perhaps unfairly, I think, was characterized even by Taiwan's de facto allies in Washington as being a bit of a troublemaker. Never had that problem with Tsai Ing-wen, and that will be something that William Lai will be seeking to continue, I think. Some of the KMT, in attacking him in the campaigns, tried to trawl through some of his history as a legislator and some of his early statements being pro-independence and so on. I think William Lai has moved on a long way from that. These days, he's a sensible person. I don't think we'll be seeing anything extreme. One thing, however, I think that William Lai may want to consider is accelerating reform of the military. This is something that I think some people were a bit disappointed about in terms of the Tsai Ing-wen record. The military is generally perceived as being quite close to the KMT, but the times have moved on. These days, the TPP need to really continue to boost the military's resources, its weapons, training, morale. It needs to drastically upgrade its reservist structures, that is to say, to bring back people who have already been trained from their compulsory military service. The 1 year of compulsory military service itself may not be such a problem in terms of time, but will the people doing military service get proper training? These are questions that are being thrown about all over the place now. And of course, also defense coordination with de facto allies, such as the United States, Japan, and perhaps increasingly the Philippines. These are things I think that William Lai should have front and center of his foreign policy. They're all deadly serious issues, and they are all in need of improvement. I'd be interested to know what Trini thinks about that.
Yes, I think Martin's points are very important and also prevalent issues and challenges that Lai's administration should take on. And as Martin had pointed out, it's most likely that Lai would continue on Tsai's current stance and handling and style of cross-strait relations, and based on parity and respect and dignity. And there's one important point that Lai has repeatedly stated, that Taiwan does not need to declare independence because Taiwan is already an independent sovereign country with the national moniker of Republic of China. So so there's no need to declare independence. And yes, indeed, in the past, there had been some rhetorics from him that might have stirred up some concerns from the international community and especially from the Americans. But I think these kind of questions or concerns have died down during the election campaign, as William Lai had repeatedly announced his policy and his principles. And I think the challenges would be how to kind of negotiate in the parliament in order to allow important legislatures to pass. And that would be related to having a good governance domestically, as well as issues pertaining to national defense and safeguarding the country. And also the challenging domestic issues would be how to meet the expectations of the young people on, resolving the challenges that is pertaining and prevalent in the society. There's low wages for the youngsters and high real estate price, and the young people do not find, the future bright, and the road is wide open for them. They find this circumstances very challenging, and they do not see a way out. And that's why many of the young voters have supported the TPP, the third party, trying to look for alternative. So I think these would be the challenges that William Lai faces when he assumes presidency.
I would also add to that summary too, something I should have added before, especially some of your listeners, Sakina, and that is we can expect William Lai's government to continue its progressive commercial policy and engagement with India. This has been one of the more interesting success stories of the Thai government over the last 8 years. And while the political ties between India and Taiwan remain quite weak, there have been some dramatic and interesting metrics indicating investment flow, which are worth exploring for those who are interested, or as well as Southeast Asia. But India, of course, is of course a crucial market for everyone, and it's something that I think we should keep an eye on.
Thank you to both our speakers for emphasizing on the really important points that the newly elected president should be adopting and the challenges that he will be facing. Now, I will move on to the next question, and the question is directed to Martin. Martin, so besides the two major parties in Taiwan, which is the DPP and KMT, we saw the rise of a third party, Taiwan's People's Party, like we've spoken about before. The party appears to have attracted significant support from the younger voters. Will DPP's success start a new era of three-party politics in Taiwan, as claimed by the party leader Kuomintang, or will politics in Taiwan go back to being mainly between the DPP and the KMT? What factors contributed to DPP receiving significant support among the younger generation in Taiwan? Martin, the screen is yours.
Thank you. It's easy, especially on when we have an online discussion, to mix up the title DPP with the title TPP. The TPP is being the Taiwan People's Party. Is the party that has the control, has the balance of power in the legislature. Again, as I said before, there have been three-party politics in Taiwan for some time, and usually the third party that has had influence has been a splinter, a dissatisfied group that has broken away from the KMT, the traditional power in Taiwan. The thing that's interesting about the TPP is that it's the Taiwan People's Party is the new third party, is it's drawn support from both sides, particularly young people, and possibly more from the DPP, from the Democratic Progressive Party, that is to say the government. This has been a problem for the government. I think in that respect, the result of this election has been very fair. I think the Democratic Progressive Party government showed that it was the best of the three parties to rule, but it did not demonstrate that it had really delivered everything that the community wanted in terms of law, in terms of new legislation, in terms of equity, parity, taking seriously the concerns of a lot of young people whose futures and careers and possibility of forming, the families they want in terms of children. We have a population growth problem here now. Like Japan, it's an aging society. All of these issues sort of lump into one, and I think there is perception that the sort of the technocrats of the government did not take a lot of this very seriously, and now they're going to have to, because the voters that put in 8 not maverick, but 8 sort of centrist legislators are going to be hammering on these issues. However, it is a vote of disaffection. It is not a vote of loyalty. We are yet to see evidence that the Taiwan People's Party is going to amount to much if Kuomintang, the chairman, is no longer associated with it. What we've seen with the previous splinter parties is as soon as the person most associated with it left or lost his popularity, the party declined very, very quickly. Such was the case with the People First Party with James Song, the former provincial governor. Such was the case with the New Party, which at the time was co-founded by the KMT's current vice presidential candidate, Zhao Xiaokang. So we need to wait some time to see what this party will be able to achieve. Some of the people who have been elected to the legislature are virtual unknowns. It's not clear what skills they have. It's not clear whether they'll be able to face up to the party machinations of the two big parties and survive. We will see in time. Now, one thing that the TPP has in its favor is that it has a competent first legislator who will probably be the leader of the caucus, and that's Huang Shanshan, the former deputy mayor of Taipei City under Kuomintang. She is competent, but she has a very narrow path to walk to meet the expectations of their voters. Now, as I suggested, some political observers are predicting the demise of the party as an influential force this term. I still think it's a bit early. Let's wait and see. But it has to be a movement more than a one-person party for it to last more than a couple of elections. One thing is for sure, though, and as Chuni just said, young people are getting fed up. They are sick of being pigeonholed with identity politics. They don't need to be told if they're Taiwanese or Chinese or both. What they want to know is, why isn't the government taking seriously economic problems that affect us and affect our lives and affect our futures? Kuomintang, the leader of the Taiwan People's Party, has a wit. He has candor. He speaks bluntly. He speaks rudely sometimes, and sometimes he speaks maybe with a slightly bigoted tongue. But he resonated with a lot of people, particularly with DPP young voters. And even if his own record as Taipei mayor was wholly unremarkable, he somehow managed to activate that support. And so people should not underestimate him. There is still a lot of time to go before this party can be written off. And I think we will see some very interesting phenomena in the legislature in the next year or two.
And Martin, the opposition Kuomintang party again lost to the DPP. The KMT was a party preferred by China as it advocates for more warmer and closer relations with Beijing. While KMT did not gain a majority in the parliamentary elections, it won the most seats, 52 in DPP's 51 in the legislative yuan. How has the party, which has historically been associated with unification and deterrence to one China, changed its approach and policies towards China? Where does the KMT go from here, and what are its prospects? Martin, is for you.
Well, if you speak to some of the more moderate people in the KMT, whether it be legislators or ordinary voters, you hear people who would just wish we could get beyond all of the sloganeering about unification and so on and so forth. And they're Taiwanese to a fault, right? They're just like everybody else. The broad church of Taiwan can be people in both parties. The problem with the KMT is that fundamentally there has been little change in the KMT's policy towards China at its core, at its leadership core. Ever since Ma Ying-jeou, the former president, purged most of the elements in the party that supported the Taiwanization trend at the beginning of his term in office in 2008, and His predecessor as president, Lee Teng-hui, who helped to Taiwanize the party and to take Taiwan on its sovereign road that we're on today, effectively abandoned Ma Ying-jeou and supported Tsai Ing-wen instead, which is extremely interesting and an informative decision for him to make. What this election, however, on the weekend has shown is the KMT's China policy remains chronically deficient. It's deficient not just because it's unable to solve problems. It's deficient also because it simply makes no sense. The KMT is still a highly effective and very welcome party at the grassroots level. When you look at local elections for mayor or county commissioner or village head all around Taiwan, the KMT remains a formidable force. But at the national level, it is now struggling to get more than 35% of the vote, regardless of what the DPP does. We saw that 4 years ago. We saw that 8 years ago. And with Ma Ying-jeou, the former two-term president, now saying things along the lines of almost we should perhaps trust in Xi Jinping, who has threatened Taiwanese lives ever since he came to office, you have to wonder whether the KMT is going to face some kind of reckoning in terms of its national narrative, which is extremely weak, to say the least. Until the KMT can deal with these limitations and create a national narrative that opposes Chinese predation unequivocally and gets behind Taiwanese sovereignty unequivocally without harping about the definition of independence, it will continue to suffer from lukewarm messaging at a national level, and it will continue to injure itself in the hands of its own hardliners. At the same time, as I said, the grassroots left support for the KMT is something that cannot be underestimated. And what that suggests is there is a significant base on which the KMT can evolve into a party that is both separate from the DPP, has its own philosophy, but does not defer to the Chinese Communist Party at crucial moments in its history.
Thank you, Martin. And the rise of the Taiwanese identity has also been a very important issue. In 1992, the proportion of Taiwan residents who identified as Taiwanese only was just under 18%, according to the survey data by National Chengchi University. By 23, that had risen to 63%. Also, the proportion of Taiwan residents identifying as Chinese only was just over 25% in 1992. And by 2023, that had also fallen to less than 3%. What is the significance of this development, and how is it shaping views on China? Martin?
I honestly, to be frank with you, Sakina, I'd prefer to hear Chuni's view on this, because we have been seeing these surveys now, and the trends have been unmistakable and very stable for 15, 20 years at least. The only thing I will say on that issue is that the significance of this trend of identification, and I should add that it's even starker than perhaps what you say, which is accurate. But if you actually look at the number of people who support Taiwanese integration, unification with China today, it's, I think, under 5% of the population, right? 5% of the population, which is a very small amount, to say the least. The significance of this overall trend is it comes down to this: only a Chinese invasion, and only mass subjugation of the Taiwanese population by a Chinese occupying government will be able to suppress a national Taiwanese identity. That is what is required to stop it. Anything short of that will see the Taiwanese national identity grow. It will become perhaps more complicated. It'll maybe split up into different units, but the arc overall will be one of unity towards Taiwan and the places that Taiwan controls. And that's something that I think the Chinese Communist Party is struggling with. I think they must understand deep down that their propaganda is not working. And so when you see Xi Jinping saying in the last few days, reiterating one country, two systems, and talking about patriotism and loving a country, It's like in Taiwan, that kind of language is water off a duck's back. No one takes it seriously, not even the KMT.
Chuni, let's hear your view. Thank you, Martin.
Yes, I would say that over the years, we see a kind of a consolidation or solidifying of Taiwan's identity. And what is Taiwan identity? I think it would translate into the hard-won way of democratic life, a life of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, protection of human rights, and the embracing of more pluralistic views. And it is this kind of common culture that everybody participated in shaping and safeguarding and also deepening in terms of democracy that kind of help forge a common identity. And China's belligerent rhetorics and behaviors also help to shape and further solidify this kind of identity. And I would say the harder that the Chinese government push the Taiwanese people, the more of the rise of a Taiwan identity. So I think there's no, especially there's for the younger generation, there's no question. Like they just see Taiwan as a separate country, having our separate identity, our way of life, our military, our own government, and we vote for our leaders, even though we may be using Mandarin, and maybe some of our ancestors or relatives may come from China. And maybe we do business with China, and some of our friends or family members go work in China and live in China for 10 years or something. And we're happy to be economic partners, but still we want to safeguard our identity and what we are and what we have. And I think this is very clear and it is very strongly seen in the election results and also in all kinds of events or incidents that allow such aspiration of Taiwan identity. For example, in international sports events, when Taiwan team wins or something, or in international awards or competitions, like in arts, movie, or whichever arena. I think it speaks a lot on the Taiwan identity, and people would just feel very proud to be a Taiwanese. That's what I
Thank
have
you
to
so
share.
much. Yeah, thank you so much, Shuni. And I think identity is something that all the other communities who are oppressed under China are fighting for, right? So how do the Taiwanese people perceive the actions of the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist parties towards the Hong Kongers, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, and other communities? To what extent has that influenced their view of China and the Chinese government? Because all these communities are also seeking their right of identity, and all China is trying to do is completely eliminate this identity, right? So can you tell us how is Taiwan viewing China and the Chinese government in this regard? Martin, will
Yes.
go with you.
Well, it's a bit of a difficult one. That if we talk about public perceptions, it's safe to say that the vast majority of Taiwanese have never been to Tibet, never been to Xinjiang, right? Possibly have never met Tibetans or Uyghurs from those locations. That tends to be the preserved more of people who are moving in those circles, including human rights circles. However, most Taiwanese, many if not most, have been to Hong Kong. Perhaps less so now. But one thing I think the thing that's important to recognize, though, is that there is a very large number of Taiwanese people in China, even now, working, studying. And while the situation there may not be as easy for them as it used to be, it's still a very formidable subpopulation there. I think the combination of that experience with the Chinese government and living in a Chinese society in its complexity in different parts of China, but also having a free media in Taiwan, the so-called vigorous, boisterous media that Taiwan is often described as having, means that there is no shortage of information coming from oppressive practices, whether it be in Xinjiang, Tibet, or Hong Kong, or anywhere else. In my experience, I'm happy to be corrected. Taiwanese tend to be quite pragmatic on some of these issues. People are not going to boycott doing business in China because of human rights abuses or crimes against humanity in other parts of the country. However, people are painfully aware of what happens to Taiwanese who try to stand up for democracy. In some cases, they get arrested and locked up for years, and only allowed to come back after a period of time where they've been subjected to God knows what in jail. I think in balance, your average Taiwanese is perfectly aware that we're dealing with a government that can be very dangerous, but by and large do not necessarily see oppressed folks as being blood brothers. For example, some people from Hong Kong have migrated to Taiwan following preceding, but also following the institution of the national security law in Hong Kong, which has been very oppressive, although we've obviously mostly seen migration to Britain. However, what people from Hong Kong face in Taiwan may not be quite what they expected. Ordinarily, there might be a lot of sympathy, but sometimes the system's still a lot of bureaucracy, and sometimes people can be thinking, well, you're still not from around here. It's a little bit complicated. It's not an easy issue to discuss in some ways. Also, they're not circles that I move in. But I think by and large, your average Taiwanese is sympathetic to oppressed people, as they are sympathetic to people from Ukraine, as they are sympathetic to people either from Israel or Gaza or anywhere else in Palestine who are being subjected to oppressive behavior. And that is one of the better things about Taiwan, is that it can stand above a lot of the fray. It can afford to say, well, there are principles at stake, not just tribalism, right? But by and large, Taiwan tends to stand back a little bit from these things. The government tends not to be too aggressive about it.
Thank you, Martin. Chuni, let's hear your view on this.
Yes, I would like to supplement that what happened in Hong Kong actually shocked the Taiwan people, especially the younger people. And in some way, it helped the Thai administration garner so much support in the 2020 presidential election. But as Martin has pointed out, most Taiwanese people are less informed and vague about the suppression and human rights abuses in Tibet and in amongst the Uyghur communities in Xinjiang, or what they prefer to be called as East Turkestan. People heard of it, but have vague ideas. But when things happen in Hong Kong and the kind of crackdown or suppression that Hong Kong people had to face, it shocked the Taiwanese people. So in that regard, I think Taiwanese people indeed had taken a much more pragmatic approach to things, but that doesn't mean that people are not aware of it. And deep down, people stay quite vigilant about the potential threat if we were to move closer to China. And indeed, there are a large number of Taiwanese business people living and working in China, as well as some students studying there. And a large percentage of Taiwan people have traveled to China as tourists. So I think in that sense, coming back to the identity issue, people do sense that it's two separate cultures, two very different political systems, and there's an underlying sense of strong Taiwanese identity and the strong wish to protect what we have and the kind of lifestyle that we have here in Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
To that, Tina, sorry, just very quickly. If we go back if you go back to the original protests in Hong Kong, the proximity of those protests were very close to the Sunflower Movement occupation of the legislature in Taiwan back in 2014, I think it was. Chuning, if I'm not wrong, there were significant connections made between the student protesters in both places.
Yes.
These are very important forerunners, if you like, to the kind of skepticism that began to inform people regarding the fate of Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And even if there are barriers between the people of Hong Kong and Taiwan, particularly language for older people, because many older people in Hong Kong still only speak Cantonese and not Mandarin very much. Nonetheless, there have been intimate connections made between democracy activists in both places. The tragedy for Hong Kong is that it had so much potential, has such a distinct culture. But also the tragedy for the Chinese Communist Party is that it explicitly made Hong Kong and Macau as workshops, experimental labs, if you like, for a one country, two systems structure that was supposed to appeal to Taiwan. And by introducing the national security law and tearing everyone down and turning children into political activists and then political prisoners, it's effectively burnt every last credible message that it can send the Taiwanese.
Thank you so much, Martin, for this extra information. Now we are moving on to our last question, and Martin, will start with you. President-elect Lai, in his victory speech, said, I quote, we are telling the international community that between democracy and authoritarianism, we will stand on the side of the democracy. And he also promised to defend Taiwan's identity. What can the United States and other democracies do to support Taiwan and the newly elected leader of Taiwan, Martin?
Well, how many countries in the world actually do anything material to help Taiwan in this regard? There are very, very few in terms of being able to make a decisive contribution. There's the United States, of course. There's Japan. There are some other countries in the region that do have potential safety valve roles to play. I'm thinking maybe of Singapore, because Singapore, of course, had military training history with Taiwan, and Singapore also, to some extent, not sure about now, but certainly historically has had something of an ear in Beijing. But other countries that purport to support liberal democracy outside their own borders, countries like Australia, like the UK, like Germany, like most of the Western nations, most of their dealings with Taiwan have been in the trade area and the cultural area. And most of these countries, because of their one China policy, but more so because of the intimidation that China indulges in if things are not going their way in terms of the Taiwan relationship, tend to sort of fall back and leave it to the Americans and leave it to the Japanese to do the heavy lifting. And of course, most of that is the Americans. So the most important thing for Taiwan is to ensure that the Americans are on board, that the Americans continue to provide the solid support that they have provided, the critical support that they've provided. The great thing about the United States is, there are many great things about the United States, but one of the things about Taiwan that is great about the United States is Taiwan has been one of the very, very few areas of policy that have united the Democrats and the Republicans in a period of the worst polarization of politics in living memory, and potentially worsening before long. What's important for Taiwan is that the American support stay rock solid and hopefully increase in terms of delivery of weapons and other, military advisors and so on and so forth, training of special forces and on US soil and all this kind of thing. The Americans must continue to do this, and they know that it's vital, because if Taiwan falls to China in any shape or form, even if it's just an embargo that locks Taiwan out of the supply chain for microchips, the fallout for the global economy and for the United States' security and defense profile in the Pacific will be greatly weakened. As for other countries, Japan they know that they'll be in big trouble if Taiwan falls. So that they certainly have a lot of sympathy for Taiwan, and in recent years they've been expressing it quite explicitly. Militarily too, I suspect there is more going on there than what we know. But as far as everyone else is concerned, it's been a constant disappointment. My own country, I can speak for maybe, Australia takes a small target approach to Taiwan as it does on other issues involving human rights, particularly in the recent decades. And unfortunately, we cannot rely on the Australian government to do the right thing in terms of the messaging. However, what's going on behind the scenes may be slightly different. But in terms of knowledge of Taiwan, knowledge of the importance of Taiwan's security and Taiwan's defense, most legislators in Australia could not care less and rarely express any statement on the matter. It's a constant disappointment. How can Taiwan relations be improved with the world? What can they do? We can expect more people who are supportive of liberal democracy everywhere, such as this new aggressive group of Czech Republic activists and politicians who are prepared to stand up to Russia and are prepared to stand up to China, despite their intimidation. We would hope that we would see more of this. There is a global alliance of parliamentarians who are now speaking very broadly about Chinese issues, including supporting Taiwan. But these are kind of baby steps. We need a more aggressive sense of support from the global community, the democratic global community, to say this to China. If you pull the trigger, the consequences for you from our end will be severe. And until they're prepared to say that explicitly, directly, and dispense with so-called strategic ambiguity, then Taiwan will continue to rely basically on the United States.
Thank you so much, Martin. Chuni, let's hear your perspective on this.
Yes, thanks, Martin, for his very elaborative speech and an appeal for the international community to support Taiwan more. I think what we need is to be included. You know, we need the international society to be more inclusive of Taiwan and to show strong solidarity for Taiwan's freedom, democracy, and human rights. And I think I would appeal to the people in the international community to influence your parliamentarians, influence your government, speak up for Taiwan in international events, in international forums, when China is trying to coerce others from kind of sidelining Taiwan or preventing Taiwan's participation. Speak up and rise up against China's intimidation or coercion. And I think there's one more good example other than the example that Martin just mentioned, the Czech parliamentarians and certain politicians in Lithuania. They set up formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan, despite the strong opposition and aggressive approach by China of severing tie with them and sanction and punishing them. They stood up and they established a, unprecedented kind of institution. And by adhering to their principle, they demonstrated to the world that it's possible and that China's rattling and rhetorics may mean something in the short term, but in the long term, the country doesn't really lose that much. Instead, it gains for the long run. So I think there are good examples to follow. So speak up for Taiwan and include Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you so much, Chuni, for giving us your invaluable insights. Very informative, very deep into today's topic. And as we conclude today's insightful panel, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to our panelists and for their valuable contributions. And I would also like to thank our audience for engaging with us in this important discussion. I would also like to thank the AFI team who have been a part of this discussion behind the screen. So good evening, and we look forward to further enlightening discussions in the future. And before I forget, the video of the session will be uploaded on Asia Freedom Institute's website, and please follow AFI's X, Facebook, and LinkedIn pages for more information on AFI's programs and activities. And I would like to thank Chuni for being here, even though you are suffering from a very bad cold and sore throat. Thank you so much for taking out your time, both Martin and Chuni. I'm really, really grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakina, and thank you, Martin.